I'd now like to welcome Michal Kurlaender, who will help us think through the importance of research in developing, implementing, and evaluating our programs. And Dr. Kurlaender is an Associate Professor of Education and a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of California, Davis. She investigates students' educational pathways, both traditional and alternative, and in particular K-12 and post-secondary alignment, and access to and success in post-secondary schooling, including both community colleges and four-year colleges and universities. Dr. Kurlaender works closely with administrative data from all three of the California's public higher ed sector, the UC system, the CSU system, and the community college system. And she also studies the impact of racial and ethnic diversity on student outcomes. So we're really lucky to have her today joining us, and thank you for coming.
I'm going to try to not use the mic. Is that going to work for folks? Okay. It's great to be here at Sierra College, and so thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about broad work that I've done on the role of the importance of research and evaluating programs and policies at colleges, and I'll pull from a variety of different papers and research projects that I've done. A lot of this is collaborative work with my graduate students and colleagues. In fact, I wasn't able to come to the Southern California event yesterday, so I sent my graduate student, who I trust did a pretty good job, Betsy Friedman, which makes me, of course, very proud. And so I just want to give some motivation on our presentation, and also just to invite you to interrupt me throughout the talk if I either speak too fast or you want some further clarification. That'll make this much more of a conversation, and Mary has promised she'll keep time for me, so we'll also make sure to leave time for Q&A at the end. I don't actually expect to get through all of this, but provide the slides nonetheless. So that I'll give some motivation and some prior literature, and then I really want to use part of our time together to talk about what I think the federal government in the last 10 years and others in the social sciences have really tried to establish around not just the importance of research, but when we think about research, when we think about evaluating programs and policies, that we develop what is often called a counterfactual thinking. And by that, it's sort of, it's difficult to implement randomized controlled trials, randomly assign your treatments to get a really, like a scientific estimate of a treatment, right? That's very difficult in many cases, though it has been done more and more in education in the last 10 years, I would say, even 15. But many times we can't do that, and we don't want to do that, either for ethical reasons or for other reasons. And so it is still helpful, though, to develop what we would call a counterfactual thinking. So we'll try to explore that a little bit, which is more conceptual but fun to do in the business of sort of taking care of yourself and having the time to think through these conceptual ideas. And then I'm going to talk specifically about work I did that is very concretely about evaluating. I work with the CSU Chancellor's Office, and they're care a lot about college completion, which, as you may know, at CSU hovers at just about 50%, even among students who are native to CSU. It's quite lower than we all want it to be, and even lower for underrepresented minority groups. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about how they could leverage the data they have to try to understand what's going on. And so I'll talk about what we did when we looked at 3 specific programs. And then I may not have time. I wanted to talk a little bit about a colleague of mine's work on summer melt, and I probably won't have time, but I'll at least give a shout out to her new book on it in case folks are interested. Okay, so here's the motivation. This is at CSU, and I should say I do a lot of work with the community college system as well, but I have for the last 6 years worked really closely with the CSU system, largely to evaluate the early assessment program. Do people know about the early assessment program? Right. So we've been tracking, in particular, we've been tracking need for remediation, developmental ed, in English and or math, and you'll see that's over 2/3 of students at the CSU system enter the system in need of either developmental English or math. Quite high, because as many of you know, CSU students enter CSU not only A to G eligible, but actually with a B+ average. So I at least find that pretty striking evidence of misalignment between our systems, if so many students enter as B+ students and are told that they require some remediation once they start there. And then you can see that 6-year graduation rate. There is a decline in the remediation need, and we're exploring that. Some of that is because CSU has changed some of the way it's doing remediation. In particular, it started this early start. Many of you may even know what early start is because some of the ways students remediate before they enter CSU is actually at community colleges. And so, again, I'm happy to clarify any of that. Sure, please.
So you mentioned that the EAP assessment is what's making them or putting them in the category of remediation?
No, so EAP is just one way that they are notified that they need remediation. So EAP is a signal that they get relatively early, and by relatively, I mean it's 11th grade. Some of us think they should know even sooner, right? But that's early is by national standards, and then they're told whether or not they're exempt from needing to take the replacement exam once they get into CSU. They can demonstrate their readiness in other ways. Honor AP classes at now it's 500 on the SAT, used to be 550. There are other ways that they can demonstrate that. But otherwise, they show up as freshmen, and it's really in the end of spring or early summer, and they take a placement test. And those placement tests, many of the ones who make it to the placement test are still deemed not ready. And then they're told they have to take some remedial courses. And the change that is that, we're hypothesizing here that the decline in 2011 is because I think the region, CSU, is it a board or regions? I forget. Anyway, it's board, right? So they decided that all students should do this before they enter the fall term. And so they're doing it in the summer. And so the count there might be a little bit different. That's what we're hypothesizing is the difference. Okay, thank you. So here's what it looks like for community colleges. And, it's different, right? So we have a lot of access to the state data sets, and so it depends on sort of what exactly you're using. Basic skills are different kind of labels attached to the course types, and many of you guys know this at the community college. And so this is just this is developmental math course taking, but tracking back as far as 1992. I like to do this because people like to sort of say, oh, so many more kids today aren't ready for college, and it's not necessarily empirically true. I don't think we've had so many changes. But here you'll see it tracked, and what we did here was we also tracked the community colleges that adopted the EAP to see if these more reform-oriented campuses might have had other changes to developmental math course taking. So the real picture that I want to draw is is sort of two big things. One, that over the last half century, I'm just going to sort of suggest to you that over the last half century, we have lots and lots of evidence that suggests more kids are going to college than ever before. And that's across the board, across all different subgroups that you can imagine. But what we also have is proportionally no better completion rates. In fact, we would argue that they're actually declining for some subgroups. So more people are going to college than ever before, but proportionally no more are finishing. And actually the rates of completion are a little bit declining for minority groups, okay? And so this is quite troubling to me, and not just to me, to many others in the research community, who have really, I would say, in the last decade or so shifted from not just focusing on access, but on focusing on completion as well, right? And that's what you guys are in the business. And so there's lots of plausible explanations for this phenomena that we see, right? So one of them might be what we call our compositional changes. And by that, I don't just mean demographics, like racial ethnic demographics. I mean truly compositional changes. And you guys probably see this more than anyone, which is today's college student looks a lot different than the college student of 50 years ago. They're more likely to be working. They're more likely to balance kids, to attend multiple institutions, to try out different things, right? So the student, the typical college student today, does not necessarily look like the typical college student of a half a century ago. So that's just sort of one plausible explanation, right? But there are others, right? So one is we live in this college for all ethos. We tell all kids to go to college, and we should, because there are important returns to going to college. I work in a middle school in Sacramento that I've been tracking these kids for quite a few years, and you'll see kids, even if they're not doing well in middle school and not doing well in high school, they'll tell you they're going to college, right? So upwards of 90% of kids, no matter how they fare at school, will tell you they're going to college, which is good. We feel like they've heard this message loud and clear, and they'll tell you they want to go. Not just because their parents tell them they should go, but they want to go. So what happens when they go? So many, even students who are not ready or who are not even sure what college is about, will enter college. And then they may learn, in that experience, in their first year experience, they may get a whole bunch of information about whether college is for them or not. And you'll see these things aren't discrete, they're all related, right? They may decide they actually just don't like it, and all of a sudden they realize, I don't have to be here, and so they decide they don't want to stay, right? But they also might feel unready, right? They might feel like they get a lot of signals from their coursework, from their peers, from their teachers, that they're not doing college level work, and so college may not be for them. They also might suddenly be concerned about their financial situation, right? So even though we've made huge headway in supporting students who aren't going to college for financial constraints, we still know that even holding achievement constant, all these things, that if you are from a low-income family, you are less likely to go to college and to finish college. So we haven't quite solved the financial constraint problem completely, right? So lack of preparation, financial concerns, and are all a part. Also, this sort of loss of interest in going to college, compositional changes, and then I would argue an area that's been the least explored are sort of institutional practices. And most of the work on college access and completion is really focused on the individual student, right? What are the demographic differences? Why are underrepresented minority students less likely to finish? Why are low-income students? And we haven't focused so much on trying to understand institutional practices, right? So we give institutions a hard time. You know, Obama and others are like sort of focused on performance funding, college completion, all this great stuff, but we actually don't know a whole lot about what happens at institutions that might better support students to finishing. And so that is, I think, a really important area of research. So the problem is, of course, of drawing a sort of causal idea of what is this practice is good. We should support all students to do it, or all colleges. So bear with me as I kind of do a few slides that are more conceptual in nature, right? So let's think about educational destinations, and you can think about it as just even types of colleges. I'll have a picture of that in a minute. So educational destinations and even program participation, ending up in a program, even ending up participating in a program that exists even at the college level does not typically happen randomly, right? We don't end up in those destinations randomly, right? So, but the problem is our desire is to determine how the outcomes of individuals who participate in a particular program or get a particular kind of experience, or we might think of it in the sort of experimental sense, a treatment, right? How does it differ? What would the outcomes have been if they didn't get that experience, right? That's what we often want to know. And so the absence of that condition is what we might think of as the counterfactual. That is the condition to which individuals would have been exposed to. What would they have done if a career ladders program wasn't there, or some other program? What would their experience have been in the absence of a particular program or policy? It's often hard to do, but the thinking around it is really important, because we often live also in a situation with really constrained resources. And so it's really important to think about the counterfactual, because we want to make decisions about which programs to expand, which programs to bring on, and they often cost or have different sort of constraints. And so thinking about well, if we didn't do this, what would it look like, is often really useful. So let me see. Okay. So let's first start with it, and I think this is sort of a ubiquitous problem that we have that plagues education research. So we've all seen these studies. I'm guilty of even writing a couple of them, like, you know, community college students, you know, are less likely to get a BA, right? And so community college, you know, the sort of beating up on community colleges and the transfer function, right? But the reality is we know that the students, right? So if the outcomes we care about, getting that degree, and let's add earnings on there, we know that students who enter a community college are probably quite different than the students who enter selective four-year for sure, but probably also the non-selective four-year, right? So what are some obvious ways in which they're different? Economics of being able to afford, many are working. Academic preparation. First generation. Right, and so those are like the obvious ones. But right, as you guys are more than any group I would ever talk to as counselors, like you would know, there's also underneath all of that a whole host of what researchers don't observe, what we would call unobserved reasons that make these kids probably really different. Everything from hesitation to family support to motivation to all of these things. Those are, I would argue, not only as important, sometimes even more important, because we can't actually control for them in a lot of these studies, right? So these are pretty different kids. So that's the easy part. But what about, let's make it a little bit harder, which is to say, okay, let's rule out these non-selective 4 years, much less selective ones. But now let's look at two types of kids, students, and community colleges. Ones that are part of a learning community and ones that are not. People know what learning communities are? Should I do any? Okay, right? So does that seem like a reasonable? Should we be able to compare the outcomes? Yes. Anyone want to disagree? No? Okay. So, all right, so then I'll disagree with you all. So tell me. So tell me how do you end up in a learning community at your college or another college?
I think that they're very different students, that students who are in developmental or who we can identify, there's some identifying factor that would historically suggest that their completion rate would be lower. We're going to steer those students towards the learning communities, where a student coming in very prepared to our campus might not be steered towards learning.
So you'd say you might actually select on these sort of potential, don't love this word, but I'm going to use it, like risk factors.
Yeah.
Okay? It's a little bit deficit thinking, but you guys will understand. So, okay, so any others? That's one really good. Any others? Anybody's learning community look a little different? Maybe they draw kids maybe not with us. By ethnic group, right? And we have lots of theory that suggests that being around students, especially if you're from a minority group, being with other students who share similar experiences might help you, right? So there's lots of good theory behind why we would do that. Any other? Yeah.
Academic focus.
Academic focus, right? So to be able to cluster these classes around a particular, at least trajectory, right? If not a specific major. Anything else? So what about how do you end up, like literally the logistics of how do you end up in a learning community? Are these students who enroll like the first day of classes? Probably not.
Yeah. In fact, at our college, we have Super Saturdays where students get a pre-exposure to them and can sign up and get on kind of a mailing list to be recruited. So
Okay, so these are kind of students who have their act together, right? More likely? Sometimes? Yeah.
It depends, because some learning communities have active and assertive kind of outreach efforts. So going out into the community, going out into the schools, going out into the churches. So it really depends on which programs
Right.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
Learning communities typically have restrictive registration, so that there has to be a process in place that gets the student in the class, whereas the non-learning communities are open registration, and you can, depending on enrollments, which we know are all tight right now, but students can just register themselves. So there's a mechanism in place that supports students in the registration process.
Right. And then what about the fact that they have to be available at those block times, right? I mean, there is some logistical, right? You need to actually be available to take those classes. Okay, so we've pointed out that, yes, so a lot of those things, like, let's say we were doing this quantitatively or even qualitatively, we can, sort of control for those, account for them in some way, a lot of those things that you said. But many you can't, right? And all in the same way that we described around the sort of unobserved factors. And so I'm not going to belabor this sort of concept of the counterfactual too much longer, but I just want to sort of set it up in this sort of very obvious way, which is let's just think of those kids, students who are in the learning community at a community college, right? And we want to know their outcomes when they are participating, right? So we know those. If you were in a learning community, and we wanted to look at your outcomes a year later, we see that. What we don't see is what your outcomes would have been if you didn't get that learning community. In exactly the same way that we don't see what your outcomes for students who didn't get the learning community would be, right? We only know that we know their outcomes, and we know that they were not in a learning community. And that is basically this problem we have, is that all of these students that we are comparing ultimately are a whole mix of students, some of whom may look like the learning community students we let in, and many of whom probably don't. Right? If, for example, we just took students who had, sort of high risk factors, and so we started, okay, well, these students are we identify through the college are going to have the hardest time persisting at the college, and we're going to put them in a learning community, right? Well, and we literally imagine drawing the students that you might guess, based on a new enrollment, are going to struggle the most, and you put them in a learning community. Well, your outcomes, if someone gave you a lot of money to study this, you may find that, well, they didn't persist as much as the control group. But of course, those students started out with a whole host of other factors, right? So you're going to look like your treatment, the learning community, was not so successful. But what the real counterfactual thinking is, well, what would have happened to these students if you didn't have a learning community to begin with? So the right comparison group isn't those students relative to everyone else. It's, in your mind at least, it's what would have happened to these high-risk students, right, if you didn't offer them this special treatment. And that's really the thinking that you want to do when you start thinking about sort of the impact of a policy or program. What's the right group to compare them to? All right, so I'm actually going to, in the interest of time, not going to belabor that more, but again, all of my slides I'm going to make available and you'll have those. So we're just going to move ahead. So I wanted to talk about very specific way we looked with CSU data. So even though at UC Davis, all my work is really on broader access institutions and trying to understand persistence and completion. And so this particular slide I'm going to show you is at a very broad access CSU. So CSUs are all look quite different from each other, but some of the CSUs are, assuming A to G eligibility, are pretty open access. And so this is, we're going to start thinking about how do you look at promising practices and policies. And so you're looking at the existing ones you have. You might consider cost if you're trying to expand. You might survey students to see what mattered to them for those who transferred, or if you just want to know, do they take advantage of open counseling sessions, peer sessions, things like that. And then of course you're going to explore the literature. So let me talk about three programs that we looked at for one CSU. So we looked at freshman orientation. That is, some people come and some people don't. We looked at whether or not students declared a major when they entered the college. Some people do and some people don't. And then we looked at the impact of Summer Bridge. So Summer Bridge, since we had this whole, thinking about learning communities, in many ways, it targets very specific types of students, right? Students that CSU might also target as being potentially at risk of not persisting. First-generation college students, students who are Pell eligible, some from underrepresented minority groups, definitely low-income students. And so we also looked at, so here are the percent who participate in these programs. This is over a few years. So you'll see only 60% of students participate in freshman orientation at this campus. Only 75% declare a major. And they have a 4% participation rate in Summer Bridge. Again, keeping in mind that they would only expect, I don't know how many they invite even to participate, but we expect that to be small because it serves a select group of students. So they said, okay, well, let's look at what the graduation outcomes are by these groups to see, by these programs and policies to see if we can leverage some of that. So here's people who participate in freshman orientation and people who don't, and here's the graduation rates. So you'll see, if you participate in freshman orientation, it looks like 17% percentage point higher graduation rate, right? Here's major declaration. So if you declare a major and if you don't, there's a difference in the graduation rates of 4 percentage points. And then what about this? If you participate in Summer Bridge, you're less likely to graduate by 7 percentage points. Any thoughts about why is that?
They're the hardest students.
That's right. It's exactly what we just said about the learning communities. So we are comparing Summer Bridge students to all those who don't, and we should not be surprised that it's lower. These are students who are there because they need that extra boost, right? And so that's why we're expecting students who are entering this program to have a whole host of potential risks for not persisting in college. Right? Does that make sense? Well, what about this? Any thoughts on this? Let's think of this as a treatment. Who's coming and who's not coming to freshman orientation?
A more prepared student, but one that has social capital.
They want to know what the requirements are so they can finish, right?
So more maybe have their gung ho, more social capital, more maybe someone who said you better go to.
Some orientations are held in the middle of the summer when students are working, can't attend, so it's not financially feasible for them.
They already understand the value of orientation.
Any others? You guys have kind of covered them all. So all that stuff you just said, some of it is very little of what you said. A institutional researcher or someone who does quantitative policy work like me can control for, right? I mean, what can we control for? We can control for race, we can control for Pell eligibility, first generation, right? Some of that would pick up a lot, but a lot of what you just said is very hard to control for, right? We don't capture it in all our, but it's probably very much operating here. So a little bit maybe operating. What do you think on the major declaration? You think some of the same stuff applies? Maybe, but maybe not as dramatic as the freshman orientation. Okay, so let's just look at here sort of the participants, and so I just wanted to show you participants versus non-participants. So this is in the freshman orientation. So 11%, just as exactly as you described. Much more likely to be first generation if you didn't participate, to be low income. We see to not be ready for math or English. Male or sort of fewer men participate in freshman orientation, and much fewer underrepresented minority groups. So much of what you guys described overall. This is what Summerbridge is exactly as we would expect, is specifically targeting underrepresented minority groups and first generation college students. And so you'll see much, much higher rates of those two groups that help explain why we saw actually lower rates of graduation than those who didn't participate. Okay, so we can adjust, as I suggested. So I left you thinking, okay, it's completely impossible. Well, it's not. People like me and others try and do it, right? And the Accountability Office at the Chancellor's Office also tries to adjust for as many things as they can. And we do a much better job, so I'll show you that. But I had a question.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I just want a little bit more details. For
Sure.
the freshman orientation,
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's face-to-face orientation, or is it online? You guys have
No, that's great. So in the years that we're looking in at the campus, we're looking at face-to-face. So a lot of these factors of coming matters. I think there are other ways to do it, but keep that question in mind as you'll see what happens when the campus decided to make it mandatory. Because that's what I'm going to show you. So the campus said, ooh, there's this big push. Why don't we just make everyone take it? And then I'll show you. You guys are on the edge of your seats. I'm going to keep you there, and then you'll see. So yeah. Okay, so we can adjust for a lot of these things, right? And then look, yes, we still see differences, but they're smaller, right? And now, I don't know if you can follow, I'm going kind of fast through the slides, but now when we adjust for those differences, that we see Summerbridge actually makes a difference, right? Because now we're accounting for similar kids, similar again on the things that researchers can control for, right? But turns out they're pretty important. When we control for those, we see that similar kids who did not get exposed to Summerbridge fared worse, okay? And we still see, that there's a benefit to declaring a major, but it's smaller now, right? There's a benefit to going to freshman orientation, but it's smaller. Okay, so then we decided to do a simulation for this campus, and we said, okay, well, what would happen if we made freshman orientation mandatory? So what did we do? We used these models, these regression-adjusted models from 2002 and 2003. Then we use the characteristics of 2004 students. Why did we do that? Well, because year by year you might have shifts in who is enrolling in your college, and we can adjust for that in these models, right? It's relatively easy to do, to just sort of say, okay, we know these things matter, but suddenly you're going to have a big influx of a certain characteristic of a student, right? Maybe first generation student. So we look at how these change, and then we predict what would happen in 2004 if all students participated in freshman orientation. So we project a gain of 4.5 percentage point. We said, okay, if you have all of your students, and again, all is not like 100%, but all of your students, we would expect a 4.5 percentage point gain, right? Because freshman orientation isn't the only thing on, predicting college completion. There's all those other things are still in the model, right? And so that means for this campus, graduation rates would go from 49.4%, yes, that's how low they are, 4-year graduation. 6 years, but at a 4-year institution. They would get to 53.9, okay? And what actually happened? Here's what it looks like. So here's the predicted graduation rate, and then here's sort of what we hoped would be, right? Orientation participation. Let's get everybody up there. And here's the actual graduation rate. So it got no better. Any thoughts about why?
Bad researcher.
Thank you, Paul. And he didn't prep me, he was going to do it. Could happen, sure. That's why we have peer review.
Could be the quality of the orientation.
Quality of the orientation. Not unrelated to what this woman said over here, right? So let's think about that. What if you expanded something? Like what happens if suddenly you had, think of what were the original numbers, how many went? You had almost like an increase of 30 to 40% people showing up at orientation. So maybe it's not the quality per se, or how we think about quality, but what happens when you suddenly have that many more people coming, right? We say it's mandatory, we say we welcome everyone, but not everyone has come. Now we make it mandatory. We actually have to assume we have to have something to give all of these folks when they come. So what quality might mean that it became shorter. Maybe that format changed. You had to deliver it differently. And I can't actually tell you all the qualitative ways in which it changed for this campus. But maybe you had to have more staff come that were less prepared to do it. Maybe staff were just tired. Maybe it was too big of enrollment, so you couldn't do some of the smaller smaller sessions.
For me, it could be kind of like going to Southwest instead of United, where in Southwest it's a cattle call kind of thing, and they're all, and in United you have a specific seat that you sit on. So it's the
United
experience of the
personally
student.
offends me as
Right.
opposed to Southwest.
Right. I mean, the experience, depending on how the student
Yeah.
experiences a connection with someone at the school as opposed to mass.
And good. Any other thing that other than quality? So quality may definitely be a factor, but anything other than I think that's a nice analogy. But there may be other things.
This is kind of an analogy, also not necessarily a different point, but it reminds me of when we started saying we're going to do ed plans for everybody. You know, and you're like, okay, so my half-hour appointments are going to go to 30 seconds per student to whip out that quality ed plan.
That's excellent. Let's stay with ed plans because that is real for you guys. That's a really great concrete example. So one is you actually feel like as a professional, the quality of those plans were reduced. There's no way you could do the kind of counseling that you needed to do when you were told to do it en masse like that, right? Something like that. So quality is different. What's another aspect of that though? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, like if it becomes the masses, then it tends to go to some kind of online format where there's maybe not interaction. You're just watching videos, answering some questions so that you can prove that you watched it. And then like in our district, it's for multiple colleges, so it's not specific all the time to the college you're at, so it's more general.
Right.
It's less specific.
Diffused, maybe.
Yeah.
Like the information you can give. Then, if you've got, let's not say 30 seconds, 3 minutes. How's that? Like,
if you have if you teach hybrid, you know that we're kind of going towards a thing where it has to be more interactive now, right? But I don't think the orientations are interactive either. So how do you want them to be motivated to listen and actually retain the information when you're not really sitting at the teaching?
Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the motivation too, it's kind of like when you're counseling someone who wants to change versus someone who court said they have to see a counselor. You have different group interactions when it's people who self-select versus people who are forced.
Great. So that is a nice way to capture the non-quality thing. So we'll come back to it. But yeah, let's get another thing on the table.
So orientation is the beginning stage, and graduation is the end stage. And a lot happens between that, which to me is retention efforts.
Yep,
So
great.
I think that the whole push is lacking in retention efforts, and I think that's why we're not seeing an increase.
Great. So let's take these two comments and really unpack them a little bit further because, well, yes, I think we can all agree the quality must have changed when you have to sort of, increase to that kind of capacity. But there are a whole host of other things which suggest there is no easy fix, right? It's just not that simple. So one part is, hey, maybe the reason we get such a, bang for our buck on a lot of treatments is because kids, students want to be there. They want to participate. And that sort of motivation that, again, researchers can't control for is a big reason of why they work. They want it. They're at your door, whatever door that is, whether it's a learning community or something else. And so that's part of why it's working is these are serving motivated students who likely, this is going to sound more negative than I mean, but may have made it anyway, right? So we need to support those students. That's not at all my goal to suggest we don't. But part of why those programs work is because they're speaking to students who are going to soak up whatever it is that you give to them, right? But other students, right, who may not get to freshman orientation for any number of reasons, or may not, show up because they're told to do the ed plan, but have there's no way 3 minutes could ever, much less 30 minutes, to get them on a track when they need more supports, and who may need it in different dosages, again, for lack of another word, but they need a different kind of treatment altogether, or more of it, or a different format, or something else. And so that is very much as much of the explanation, if not more, because we don't want to beat up completely on quality. You always have to be careful not to beat up on yourselves too, because there is only so much you can do. You think, okay, I'm serving, why aren't 40% of people coming to freshman orientation? Let's push out, let's get the letters out, let's tell them they have to come, right? Because what we're telling them is so important. Yes, quality is a part of it, but it's probably not as big a part as all of these other components as well. And those are just as important.
We have just about 5 to 7
Okay,
minutes.
so I'll stop. Yeah, let me get one more and I'll actually stop. Thank
I
you.
just wanted to notice the years of how you track the 2002 to 2004. So a lot of students don't finish in that particular.
Oh yeah, no, these are the cohorts.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, yeah, they're the cohorts. They start. We track them actually for upwards of 6 years we give them to finish.
Graduation rates, and it takes students a lot.
Oh yeah, no, we don't ever report CSU graduation rates. That if we don't have at least 6 years to track them, we don't even report it because it's unfair to sort of Good, but thank you for asking that. All right, so I'm going to quickly say some of this, and then we'll just open it up to other questions. And so I think I wanted to leave you with some principles of, okay, I gave you this nice kind of research talk, or maybe it wasn't nice, but you listened anyway politely and participated, and now what can you take away? How can you use it? And so I wanted you to leave you with some principles. And so one is to think about who is affected, because that really is about sort of the counterfactual thinking, right? So who currently participates in a program that you might be thinking about our activity? If creating a new program, will it be voluntary? And then who's likely to participate? What are the differences between participants and non-participants? Is there any enforcement regarding who participates? Because that's likely to make a difference. And then one thing we didn't nearly have enough time to talk about, but which is hugely important and it was kind of implicit in a lot of the comments you guys made, is what's the mechanism at work? Like, we're just assuming freshman orientation is a good thing, like the delivery, but what are they getting at that freshman orientation? What's the point of having a mandatory ed plan? Like, what do we think we're giving students? What's the mechanism by which we think that's going to change outcomes? And is this mandatory ed plan the best way to get there, right? Maybe, and maybe for some students, and maybe not for others, right? So thinking it's not just about who participates and who's actively getting it, but it's really what evaluators would call the theory of action, or I call, as a researcher, the mechanism. Like, if we think this is going to happen, by what mechanism? We're going to get students more motivated? Are we going to give them more information, more supports, and in what format? So that's thinking about the mechanism. And then lastly, I will end with this plea, is how to track change and think about it. And really, what I would argue, what's been the most beneficial for my career as a researcher is to partner with practitioners. So to talk a lot to people who are on the ground working with students, to think about if I'm even investigating the right thing. And so this is my plea to say, hey, you have IR offices, you have other researchers in your community, whether it's UC Davis or the Chancellor's office or whatever, who would be very open to collaborating with you on how to track change. And so I think that's really super important. So I will end there I have like 3 minutes for more Q&A, is that, yeah? Now you're all quiet. I could have shown you more slides. No. Okay, yeah, I'm definitely not going to show you. I think I just wanted to, I think my email is there, so yeah. People need to reach me, and I'll make the slides.
So I like the question she posed to us. Have you done any research on community colleges? This is all Cal State.
Yeah, no, I have done lots. I think I just wanted to talk about sort of looking at specific programs. Yeah, so I've been working with the Chancellor's Office for quite a while. My latest work is actually more tracking, so I've done quite a few papers on EAP and its impact on community colleges, and also on differences in developmental course taking for racial ethnic minorities. So I find I'm able to sort of match my data to K-12 data, which is really hard for you guys to do, but to sort of control for the input students bring into the community colleges in terms, and so I have a paper that actually looks at how students of similar academic abilities, that underrepresented minority groups are more likely to be placed in developmental ed than are similarly achieving non-minority or white students and Asian students, and so I've done some work on that. And then some of my newest work is on CTE pathways, and I'm looking at working with the Chancellor's Office. We just got a grant together to look at how to think about people who aren't necessarily degree bound, but who are taking, how do we account for students who are at the community college trying to build skills, skill builders or sort of non-degree intending students, and how to track them. But in general, have lots of broad interest on supporting community college students, not just for transfer, but for other career pathways and for CTE degree obtainment. So yeah, I'm always happy. I'm not as good about putting up my papers on my website, but I'm always happy to email them to you. So if you're interested, send me an email.
I
Yeah.
had a question. So right now, because of the Career Pathways Trust, a lot of the work is about connecting between high school and community college and at the pathway level. And many of the consortia that are working are trying to build introductory kind of activity, the matriculation process brought into the high school. Looking at the assessment challenge that we have with Acupacer and others that don't place the students oftentimes in the right courses, but using the multiple measures or the Long Beach path, Promise Path, and so forth. Are you doing any research?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that Long Beach kind of there's a lot in the academic literature alone. I would say there's so much on remediation, and I would say the evidence on it is mixed at best on whether it works, and by that I mean sort of having a lot of it helps. And so I think when the research is not clear on what the best practice is, I think it's ripe for kind of innovation and trying different things. Not everybody has the capacity to do that, or the even courage, I would say, to do it, but people are, and so I think there are ways. But to your first point that you made, I do think the K-12 system, and I'm in conversation with them as well about how now with SBAC, the Smarter Balance Assessments, how we can have better tracking on students who are exposed in their K-12 experiences to these career pathways, many of which are partnered through the community college system. So I think it's amazing the number of students in the state who touch community colleges before they ever, are formally in their 13th year. And so I think they are really trying to understand how we can leverage that as a way to sort of improve not just actual employment, but also other CTE pathways. So yeah, I think there is a great conversation about that. You need me to stop. I could talk all day. It's what I do for a profession. So thank you.